One of the most common questions I get asked by budding Bandalorists is, how do you date a yo-yo? Now, if you're unsophisticated, you may want to know what a Bandalorist is, and that is a person that collects yo-yos. Now, having understood that, I confer upon you sophistication. Your certificate is in the mail, and we may proceed. Let's look at the big picture first. I break down yo-yo history into 4 periods. There's the pre-yo-yo or the Bandalore Age. There's the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Modern Age. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on the different yo-yo eras here because I've already done a video on the subject. And if you are one of the few people in the entire world that has not seen it already, I want you to know that most folks watch it 3 or 4 times. So you can check out this video. I'll put a little link in the discussion below if you want a little more detail on these yo-yo eras or periods. Now, for those rare folks that missed the yo-yo eras video, I'm going to give you just a little brief summary, just so you know what I'm talking about here. Yo-yos prior to 1928 would be in the Bandalore Age or pre-yo-yo age, and these yo-yos would be called Bandalores. As the definition for antique is an item that's over 100 years old, most Bandalores currently would be considered antique. Vintage yo-yos, on the other hand, are over 20 years old, and they shouldn't have been manufactured in the last 20 years because some yo-yos, they'll start making them and they'll make them for like 10 years. So if they started making it 30 years ago but made it for 15 years after that, it's still not vintage. So a word of warning here. Please do not refer to older players as vintage throwers. It really pisses them off. Okay, the golden age of yo-yos is from 1928 when Pedro Flores introduced the word yo-yo to the United States to 1965 when the yo-yo name lost its trademark status and became a generic term for the toy in the United States. This could also be called the demonstrator age. The Silver Age, some might call this the responsive age, is from 1965 to 2000, and the Modern Age, or unresponsive age, is from 2000 until current. So, you've got this yo-yo, and you want to know what the age is. First, you want to look at the seal on the yo-yo. If there is no seal, excluding some very rare exceptions, the yo-yo is pretty much worthless as a collectible. Now, once you have identified what is on the seal, the next step would be go to a good guide, and I would suggest, and I can assure you I am completely unbiased in this recommendation, Lucky's Collector's Guide to 20th Century Yo-Yos. And you can see if it is listed. If the yo-yo appears in the guide, then it's going to be either a Golden Age yo-yo or a Silver Age yo-yo. But what if you're at a flea market or a garage sale and you find a yo-yo and you are not carrying around this guide with you as required by federal law and many local ordinances? Well, what should you do? I'm going to give you several little tips on how to identify a possible age for the yo-yo. Now, if you are not a Bandalorist, please quit watching right now. These are secret tips only for the ears of those that identify as certified Bandalorists. Anybody learning these tips that is not a Bandalorist will never win the lotto, so don't risk it. Okay, so let's start by looking at this fine specimen of a yo-yo. This yo-yo is individually packaged in a poly bag, but it busted open, so this is a good chance to show a yo-yo that was originally in a package but now loose. The yo-yo has no seal, but because it still has its display card, it has some provenance. Plus, these concentric ring yo-yos are unusual for having jewels, and these features does make this particular yo-yo an interesting collectible. But how old is it? Well, first tip. Prior to around 1960, most yo-yos were retailed in display boxes. None of these yo-yos were usually individually packaged. Individual packaging of yo-yos didn't start until the 60s, and even though there were some companies that continued using display boxes, Generally, the display boxes morphed in displaying individually packaged yo-yos. And for example, here's an example of a Disney Orangeburg display box from the early 70s, which shows individually packaged yo-yos. But you can see how bulky this is and how much shelf space it takes up. Retailers are trying to make coin, so hanging cards are much more practical than display boxes for preserving shelf space. Now, returning to our concentric ring yo-yo. So we know from this tip that this yo-yo was made from 1960 or later. Now, many of these 1960 packaged yo-yos were in poly bags. In the mid to late 60s, there was a switch to blister card packaging. So we can approximately date this yo-yo to the 60s, but can we be a little more precise in dating? Perhaps. You may notice that the word yo-yo is not used on the display card. It is named a jeweled top. No mention of the word yo-yo. Not using the word yo-yo was common practice prior to 1965 by many companies producing yo-yos because yo-yo was a trademark of Duncan. Now, Duncan did dual training of their yo-yo demonstrators in hitman capabilities to dissuade other companies from using the word yo-yo. Okay, that's not true. But I still maintain some suspicions about Dale Oliver. I think he may have a skill set that he is not revealing to the rest of us. And you thought those carving knives were only used on yo-yos. Anyway, the word yo-yo went generic when Duncan lost the trademark lawsuit by the Royal Yo-Yo Company in 1965. So in 1965, anyone in the United States could use the word yo-yo because it became generic. But not in Canada, where the yo-yo trademark still has trademark status. Canada, I implore you, please set it free, set it free. Anyway, I would date this yo-yo somewhere between 1960 and 1965. Now, here are some more examples of polybagged yo-yos, which I feel are from this 1960 to 1965 era. And notice they are not using the word yo-yo. So here's a Parks Twirly, and this example is a giant spinner yo-yo, although it's not very giant. And here is a Natson twirler top, which is jeweled. All of these yo-yos are in poly bags with header cards. Other earlier Golden Age yo-yos, not using the term yo-yo, are out there, but these were not in poly bags but sold loose in display boxes. And here are a few examples of yo-yos of this type. Here's an example of one of the Flyback 45. Again, that's pre-Silver Age, Golden Age yo-yo. No word of yo-yo on the packaging. So, lack of the use of the word yo-yo would suggest that these different yo-yos that use these different terms are Golden Age yo-yos from before 1965. Now, an astute Bandalorist might say, but what about the Dell Yo-Yo Company and Royal Yo-Yo Company? Gotcha. They were using the word yo-yo on their yo-yos prior to 1965. And this, of course, is why Duncan brought the lawsuit against the Royal Yo-Yo Company and the Dell Yo-Yo Company. And Dell folded, but Royal continued on. And then you've got to consider the hitman demonstrators had not been successful in wiping out these companies, or maybe they did work in Dell, who knows? But that is only my speculation. Now, this Duncan lawsuit with Royal and the loss of the word yo-yo as a trademark also can help us identify Duncan yo-yos from different eras. Only Golden Age yo-yos made by Duncan will show the little R with a circle around it, registered trademark. It'll be either next to or most often below the word yo-yo, designated. It designates it as a registered trademark. But here's the weird thing about that. Prior to World War II, most Duncan yo-yos didn't use the registered trademark on the seal, even though they owned the registration. They didn't start displaying the registration mark until they were getting into battles over the trademark status, which was in the 50s and 60s. So most Duncan yo-yos that had a registration mark associated with the word yo-yo were made between 1949 and 1965. No registration mark? Well, you have just scored a yo-yo that's over 75 years old. Cha-ching! Now, how did other companies respond to the word yo-yo going generic? I envision in my mind massive parties involving alcohol, cocaine, and dancing girls, but more likely they just started using the word yo-yo on their yo-yos. And a good example of this is the Flyback yo-yo. You can see here the original Golden Age Flyback yo-yo, which they called a return top, now is called a Flyback yo-yo. So we can look at these Flyback yo-yos and say they are Silver Age yo-yo, but a Flyback return top is a Golden Age yo-yo. Word of warning, that little piece of trivia should never be mentioned on a first date with either sex unless you were already looking for the exit door. With all Duncan Silver Age yo-yos and beyond, you will see the registered trademark is missing next to or below the word yo-yo. However, you will see a little registered trademark behind the name Duncan. And this is especially helpful if you are looking at reproductions of earlier Duncan models from the Golden Age. And it's also a great gotcha moment for dealing with dealers that are trying to pass off reproduction stuff as original. For example, this reproduction Wood Duncan tournament yo-yo, it is easily seen that there is a registered trademark after the word Duncan, but none associated with the word yo-yo, which means this is not a Golden Age yo-yo, but a reproduction. So what if you're dealing with non-Duncan yo-yos? What are some of the tips that can help you with their age? Well, first, is there a patent number on the yo-yo? If there is, then you can look up and usually date the patent number. And here's a spinning clown yo-yo with a patent number, and it can be easily dated. Now, learning it from the 50s makes this a much more desirable yo-yo to collect unless you have coulrophobia. And if you do, watching this little clip will make you wet your pants. Now, what if the yo-yo says made in occupied Japan or made in the German-US zone? Well, this can definitely help date a yo-yo because occupied Japan was used from 1945 through 1952, and the German-US zone was made in 1945 through 1950. So here's an example of a yo-yo that we know was made in the 40s between 1945 and 1950. Interestingly enough, this particular yo-yo was also made earlier, even into the very early 30s. Those earlier models would not say made in the US zone, which helps date the earlier ones from the examples made in the 40s. Now, say you have an advertising yo-yo that has a phone number on it that's alphanumeric. Now, if you've never had to dial a phone number with a rotary phone, you probably also have never drank directly from a garden hose either, which means you have led a very sheltered life, and I do feel very, very sorry for you. Most phone systems had switched by the late 1960s to purely numbers. So if the yo-yo has an alphanumeric phone number on the seal, it is most likely a Golden Age yo-yo. What if you discovered a yo-yo that actually still had its mailing package, or maybe an address on a display card for the manufacturer? Can that help date the yo-yo? Well, if there is no zip code, it was probably mailed before 1963 because 5 numbered zip codes were only between 1963 and 1984. Prior to 1963, no zip codes. If there's a 9-number zip code listed on the address, then you know it was made after 1984. Personally, I think in 2025, we should go to a 12-digit zip code, if only for the one reason to help future Bandalorists date yo-yos that are being made today. So far, my requests have been unanswered by the U.S. Postal Service, but that may be because I made up my own 12-digit return address zip code. Now, what if the card that the yo-yo is on has a barcode? Would this help data? Two-dimensional barcodes really didn't come common use until around 1977. And it's very likely that if you have a carded yo-yo with a barcode on it, it will be manufactured after 1977. Also, if you see somebody with a barcode on their neck, you can break the ice by saying, hey, I bet you got that after 1977. A scintillating conversation will usually follow. If a card has a QR code on it, QR codes didn't come around into common use until around 2010. So the chances are that this is a modern yo-yo, and as a side note, in my humble opinion, barcode tattoos on the neck are much cooler than QR code tattoos. But I may be dating myself here. So there you have it. Go out and date some yo-yos. Okay, that sounded a little bit weird if you take it out of context.